In 1945, an American general made sure an entire Japanese town got sprayed with plague-infected fleas. Then he made sure the paperwork vanished. That general never faced a jury. He got a medal, a pension, and a quiet retirement in Florida. The reason you've never heard his name isn't an accident. It was policy. Because when the war ended, the winners sat down and decided which parts of World War II you'd get to read about. 10 things didn't make the cut. Stay till number 1, because it's the reason numbers 10 through 2 were ever secrets in the first place. Let's start small, with balloons. Fact 10, the balloon bombs. The continental United States was bombed during World War II. Civilians died on American soil. Your textbook skipped it. Japan built around 9,000 balloons out of paper and silk, strapped explosives to them, and released them into the Pacific jet stream. The math said some would drift 6,000 miles and land in North America. It sounded insane. It worked. They were called Fugo bombs. And for months they drifted across the ocean while the US government quietly freaked out. Because here was an attack nobody could see coming and nobody could stop. Then, May 1945, a Sunday school picnic in the woods near Bly, Oregon. A pregnant woman named Elsie Mitchell and 5 children found something strange on the ground, a battered balloon with a metal canister attached. One of them tugged at it. The blast killed all 6. They were the only enemy-inflicted civilian deaths on the contiguous US mainland in the entire war. And what happened next is the actual story. The government imposed a total news blackout. Newspapers were ordered silent. Obituaries ran with no cause of death. Japan never learned its wind currents worked. Smart, militarily. But think about what that meant inside those families. Parents buried 6 people, including their own pregnant daughter, and were told nothing. For weeks, the official story was basically silence. The cover-up worked, militarily speaking, which taught Washington something dangerous. Erasing history is easy, and nobody gets punished for it. Keep that lesson. You'll need it at number 1. Fact 9. The invasion of nothing, August 1943. The Allies stormed the island of Kiska in the frozen Aleutians. 300 ships, 34,000 troops, waves of bombers softening the target for weeks. The men hit the beaches in fog, thick enough to hide your own hand. And the island fought back. Snipers from the mist. Booby traps under every boardwalk. Friendly fire ripping through units who couldn't see 3 feet in front of them. In 3 days of chaos, the Allies took over 300 casualties. Dead and wounded, fighting house to house through the ruins. There was just one detail worth mentioning. The Japanese had left. 3 weeks earlier, every single soldier evacuated under cover of fog in a retreat. So clean the greatest intelligence apparatus on Earth missed it completely. 35,000 men, hundreds of casualties, an entire naval task force, sped capturing 0 enemies on an empty rock. Washington classified the scale of the blunder, and the public spent the war believing Kiska was a victory. When your side's disasters stay secret, only one side of the war ever gets written down. Remember that too, because at number 4, you'll meet a man the history books wrote off entirely, who deserved the opposite. Fact 8. The suicide dogs. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was losing tanks faster than it could build them. So Moscow came up with a solution involving dogs and explosives. The concept: strap anti-tank mines to trained dogs. The dog runs under a German tank, a lever on its back gets pressed, boom. Cheap, loyal, and impossible to draft dodge. The training went fine, right up until deployment, because the Soviets trained the dogs under Soviet tanks, which run on diesel. German tanks ran on gasoline. So on the battlefield, the dogs did exactly what they were trained to do. They searched for the familiar smell of home. They ran back under the Soviet tanks. The Red Army had engineered a weapon specifically designed to destroy its own front lines. Official Soviet records admit dozens of their own vehicles were destroyed this way before the program got quietly shelved. Because what comes next isn't funny at all. Fact 7. The island Britain. Poisoned on purpose. Off the coast of Scotland sits a small green island called Gruinard. Sheep graze there for centuries. Nobody lives there. Nobody can. In 1942, the British government wanted to know one thing. Could anthrax wipe out a city? So they bought the island, shipped in a flock of sheep, and dropped anthrax bombs on them. The sheep died within days. Mission accomplished. Except anthrax spores don't expire. They don't wash away in rain. They sit in soil and wait. And Gruinard had been soaked in billions of them. Within weeks, dead sheep were washing up on the Scottish mainland, killed by a disease no farm anywhere near them had. Britain quietly bought every carcass, kept the operation classified, and simply closed the island. No warning signs for locals, no announcement. Fishermen who rode past it had no idea they were passing a live bioweapons site. Gruinard stayed quarantined for 48 years. Not until 1986 did the government return, in hazmat suits, to strip off and incinerate the entire topsoil, layer by layer. A weapons test from 1942 made British land unlivable into the lifetime of people watching this video. And if you're wondering whether governments told anyone what they were spraying on people during this war, they didn't limit it to islands. Fact 6. The harbor full of mustard gas. December 1943. The port of Bari, Italy. Dozens of Allied ships packed so tight the harbor looked like a parking lot, which is exactly what a German bomber flight found that evening. One bomb hit an American Liberty ship called the John Harvey. It exploded with such force that windows shattered a mile away. And the fireball burning on the water wasn't ordinary cargo. The Harvey's hold contained 2,000 mustard gas bombs. Top secret. The Americans weren't supposed to have chemical weapons in theater at all, so almost nobody aboard even knew what they were carrying. Mustard gas vapor poured off the burning ship and spread across the water, where hundreds of sailors were swimming for their lives, coated in oily sludge they assumed was fuel. Here's the part that turns a disaster into a crime. The surviving officers knew what was in that cargo and stayed silent because revealing it meant admitting the illegal secret. So for days, military doctors treated hundreds of men for burns from fuel while the actual agent ate through skin, eyes, and lungs. Men who could have been saved with decontamination died blindfolded by their own chain of command. The full casualty count was classified for decades after the war. The families got file numbers, not answers. If hiding a weapon feels bad, what the US military did with that same gas to its own soldiers is worse. Fact 5. Gas chambers, American-run. You enlisted to fight fascism. You put on the uniform, and then your own government locked you in a chamber and opened a valve of mustard gas. This happened. Roughly 60,000 American servicemen were used in classified chemical experiments, and the military wasn't random about its test subjects. It sorted them by race. African American soldiers, Japanese American soldiers, some pulled straight from internment camps, Puerto Rican soldiers. They were tested separately from white troops because the researchers wanted to know if different races had different resistance to chemical weapons. The science was eugenics wearing a lab coat. The results found what anyone not running a racist experiment already knew. No meaningful difference. The burns didn't care about the volunteers' ancestry. Blisters, scarred lungs, lifelong respiratory damage, and orders to tell absolutely no one. Participants signed secrecy oaths. Veterans spent 50 years unable to tell their own doctors why their skin reacted to sunlight like that. When the program finally surfaced in the 90s, the government's response was an apology and a compensation process so slow most of the men died waiting for it. So the good guys experimented on their own soldiers and buried it. Does that change how you feel about everything else in this list? Hold on to that discomfort, because the next fact is going to break your brain in the opposite direction. Fact 4. The Nazi who saved 250,000 lives. Nanjing, China. December 1937. The Imperial Japanese Army takes the city, and over the following 6 weeks commits atrocities on a scale that shocked even a world already at war. Mass executions. Systematic rape on a historic scale. Tens of thousands dead, then hundreds of thousands. Foreigners fled. Almost everyone with a passport got out. One man stayed. A German businessman named John Rabe organized a safety zone in the middle of the city, a pocket of 22 refugee camps sheltering an estimated 250,000 civilians. When Japanese soldiers climbed the walls, Rabe walked out to meet them. Alone, again and again. He physically pulled soldiers off women. He filed complaints by the hundreds. He kept diaries documenting everything, page after page of atrocities, recorded by an eyewitness the tribunal courts would later have loved. And here's the kicker that makes this fact famous. John Rabe was a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. Living in Germany, he wore the swastika. When he returned home and lectured about Japanese atrocities, the Gestapo arrested him. Sit with the irony. The man who did the most to stop the rape of Nanjing owed his authority to the regime everyone else was fighting. History handed him the villain's costume, and he used it as body armor for 250,000 people. After the war, stripped of his party status, Rabe and his family starved in occupied Berlin until the Chinese citizens he'd saved sent him money and food, monthly, until he died. History isn't heroes and villains, it's people, some wearing the wrong uniforms. Which brings us to a man wearing the right one, whose statue stands in London to this day. Number 3 is the reason this list exists. Fact 3. Churchill's famine. Ask anyone in India about Winston Churchill, and they won't mention London, 1940. They'll say Bengal, 1943. While Churchill was saving Europe, Bengal was starving. By the end of it, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people were dead. Not from drought. Rice existed, ships existed. What was missing was permission. British authorities had confiscated Bengali boats and rice carts ahead of a feared invasion. Farmers couldn't move crops. Then, as shortages turned lethal, requests to redirect food shipments to Bengal were refused, repeatedly, at the highest level. Ships carrying grain passed India en route to Europe. Stockpiles in Calcutta fed wartime industry while bodies collected on the streets outside. Churchill's own war cabinet discussed the famine in minutes. His Secretary of State for India, Leo Amory, who'd known Churchill for decades, wrote in his private diary that Churchill's attitude toward Indians made him approach Hitler in some respects. And then there are the words. When officials begged him to act, Churchill asked, famously recorded by multiple witnesses, why Gandhi hadn't died yet. He suggested Indians were multiplying because there was nothing else to do. They bred like rabbits. A beastly people with a beastly religion, he called them, according to Amory's account. None of it appears in the standard Western textbook chapter on Churchill. There, he is the man who stood alone. In Bengal, he is something else entirely. Both descriptions describe the same man, and the version you got was chosen for you. You're probably angry right now. Good, save some of it. Because the next two facts are the ones the paperwork really tried to kill. Fact 2. The Disney Channel SS officer Germany surrenders. The Nuremberg trials begin, and the US Joint Chiefs realize they have a problem. The scientists who built Hitler's miracle weapons are about to be tried, imprisoned, or recruited by the Soviets. Washington's solution was called Operation Paperclip. The name comes from the paperclips literally fastened to the dossiers of men whose files needed rewriting. Over 1,600 Nazi scientists, engineers, and technicians were smuggled into the United States. Their membership records, their slave labor records, their body counts, sanitized or destroyed. President Truman approved it without knowing the details. The officials managing the program deliberately kept the worst files out of his sight. Meet the program's crown jewel, Wernher von Braun, SS officer. The V2 rocket, built at a tunnel complex where 20,000 concentration camp prisoners died manufacturing it, rained on London, Antwerp, Paris. Each rocket killed more people building it than it hit. Von Braun's reward, NASA, American citizenship. The Saturn V, the machine that carried Apollo to the moon, bears his fingerprints. And in the 50s, America watched him on television in Disney's Man in Space specials, charming millions of kids about rocket ships, introduced as a visionary. Imagine being a Londoner who survived the Blitz, switching on the TV a decade later, and seeing the man whose missile leveled your street smiling next to Mickey Mouse. That's not a hypothetical feeling. Millions lived it without ever being told. An SS career became a footnote, which sets up the deal that makes everything else on this list make sense. Fact 1. The fleas. Remember the general from the start of this video? Here he is. Unit 731. Harbin, Japanese-occupied Manchuria. The Imperial Japanese Army's biological warfare facility, and the most evil address of the entire war, which is saying something given the competition. Inside, researchers infected prisoners with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhus, often by sealing them in chambers with infected fleas or forcing disease into their bodies directly. They performed vivisection on living subjects, without anesthesia. To study the effects of untreated wounds and diseases, people were operated on until they died on the table. Frostbite experiments froze limbs and then thawed them by striking them. Whole families went in. Nobody came out. The staff had a word for the people they murdered. Maruda. Logs. Because the official cover story presented the facility as a lumber mill. Somewhere between 3,000 and 12,000 human beings died inside those walls. At the war's end, retreating Japanese forces dynamited the site and released the remaining infected animals, causing local epidemics that killed thousands more civilians after the fighting stopped. The lead scientist was General Shiro Ishii. He should have hanged at Tokyo. Instead, when American investigators caught up with him, Washington cut a deal. Total immunity, no trial, no testimony, in exchange for the research data. Decades of human experimentation data no other nation possessed. The US paid for it in cash and secrecy, and quietly built its post-war bioweapons program on top of it. The Soviet Union did prosecute 12 lower-ranking Unit 731 members. The American response to those trials was to dismiss the findings as communist propaganda. The US press printed that dismissal as fact. Ishii retired comfortably. He lectured in Maryland. He died peacefully at home in 1959. Now, the general from our opening spraying plague fleas over a Japanese town as a field test. That happened under the same umbrella, same program, same logic, same disappearing paperwork. And that is why this list exists. Because once you've traded justice for bioweapon data, you can hardly lecture the public about war crimes. Every atrocity we covered tonight, the blackout over the balloon bombs, the silent sailors at Bari, the gas soldiers, the erased famine, lives in the shadow of that one decision. The cover-ups weren't paranoia. They were consistency. History isn't what happened. It's what the winners agreed to write down. And now you know what they left out. So the question isn't whether they lied to you. It's what else is still classified. Hit subscribe, because next week, I'm covering something even more disturbing. And trust me, they buried that one even deeper.